So, Marla, you're new here, but Shirley and Joanne, you're new, but this is your first lecture series too, Will. So let me introduce you. First, let me just say that today's lecture is Women Get the Vote. It's a 4-part lecture series on the ratification of the 19th Amendment. This live lecture series is presented by Mr. Joseph Britto, Adjunct Assistant Professor at SUNY Orange, and Professor Emeritus, SUNY New Paltz. The lectures are being held here as opposed to the Town of Crawford Town Hall, as we had said originally. So it'll be at 2 o'clock on Thursdays for the next 3 parts of the lecture series. Today's lecture is Women's Place. Then the next lecture is Seneca Falls. After that is Disputes Within the Movements. And the last one is called Unfinished Business. Feel free to ask questions, and it's all yours.
Thank you, ma'am.
You're welcome.
Do you have copies of the program, so to speak?
This one, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, I can
Anybody
make
wants-
some more.
Yeah, please. So thanks for coming out, particularly on this nasty, nasty day. This is different, doing it for the crowd at home, as well as for you all that are here. My plan is that in this 4-episode discussion, excuse me? In this 4-episode discussion, we're going to talk about, for those of you who have come to any of the things that I've ever done before, I like to paint a picture of what's going on. Before we start talking about a serious attempt by women and men, and some men, to push this legislature through and get women to vote. And those who oppose them, of course. And number 2, the different conflicts within the women's movement. One of the things I think to emphasize in all of this, and we'll talk about it as we go along, is that this wasn't a very unified movement, even among women, particularly among women. And it wasn't always just men that opposed women getting the vote. It was also a lot of women who opposed it also. And we'll see that later, skipping ahead to the 4th part of the series, when we talk about what's to come, and we talk about some of the things that are going on in our own time. I'm going to emphasize too the political and the economic and the historical factors that lead up to this. This was something that was happening all over the world, not just America. We're particularly much focused in just the United States in terms of these discussions. But again, and I've learned this over teaching history for a long time, that even when you teach American history or European history or whatever, you have to encompass what's going on in the rest of the world. You have to encompass how it affects the rest of the world, and particularly how the rest of the world has affected our history in so many ways. And we'll talk about that from the very beginning as soon as we start. So without further ado, are there any general questions about what we're doing, how we're doing it? Please feel free not only to ask questions, but if you have a statement that you want to make, if you have something to say and you just, it's burning to get out, let it out. And we'll talk about that. I don't have a problem with getting interrupted, so to speak, and all that stuff. I don't mind it. Okay. So the very, very first thing we're going to talk about is, and I want to use this because I'm getting old and I can't see as far as I used to. There are a number of factors that really shaped women's lives in America, in the United States. And I want to go over them. I want you to, if you can, remember them, or maybe harken back to them. We'll repeat it. Women were fundamentally believed by most, even women themselves, to be different than men. To be absolutely different than men. They were on a pedestal. They were usually placed on a pedestal in many cultures. And of course, we're going to talk about the cultures that most impact on the United States and America in the beginning. but they were put on a pedestal, and that pedestal was great on the one hand, because it exalted them, but on the other hand, it kept them on that pedestal and prevented them from getting into business, getting into a more concerned, what we're talking about actually, a more concerned political role in terms of most of the world. Secondly, industrialization, this is happening in America as we get past the 1840s, 50s, 60s, industrialization is taking off. And as industrialization takes off, and its great benefit to property owners and men who are in business, et cetera, it also opens new opportunities for women. It kind of has to. It wasn't designed necessarily to do that, but it just turned out to do that. So remember the growing industrialization. And finally, thirdly, slavery. Slavery in the United States, slavery that had lasted 200 to 300 to 400 years in some places, was an absolute significant thing about America. The African American slavery is what we're talking about. I did a program some time ago about slavery in the world, and slavery's been around since we started to actually write history. But Afro-American slavery is very specific, and it's colored who we are up till the present day, as we know from things that are happening in the present day. So I wanted to make those comments first. And then we can start where we start with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Now, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was the treaty that ended the Mexican-American War in the United States and Mexico, and a war that took place, began and ended in 1848. This war was very, very significant on a number of levels, and as we talk about some of the people involved, we'll get into more about that. But the treaty is, the first thing I wanted to emphasize is essentially, generally put, the fact that Americans started to move westward. The United States America was first, of course, the British colonies, the 13 colonies, or so in the very, very beginning. We're talking about after Columbus, after the Americas are inhabited by Europeans and then African Americans too. And what happens in this particular case is that the colonies are bursting through. People want land. Americans have been moving westward even before the Mexican-American War. But when the Mexican-American War was fought and won in a relatively short period of time, this literally opened up the whole western part of the country all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And this coincided with a movement, a philosophical movement across the United States that really, really emphasized the fact that Americans, and by these I mean Euro-Americans, the descendants of Europeans, had a God-given right to inhabit the entire continent. Well, the Canadians were in Canada, the Mexicans were in Mexico, but from sea to shining sea, remember that? From the East Coast to the West Coast, that we had, and again, it was almost religious, and we'll talk about religion in this context anyway, because religion was much more important on an everyday scale than it's ever been. So because of this movement and because of this feeling and these beliefs, people started to move west anyway. Because of a number of factors, again, that we'll talk about later, we got into a war with Mexico over the boundary, actually. And what happened was that at the time that this was happening, we Americans wanted to expand to the west. Already by that time, by the 1840s or so, slavery was very, very much established in the South. There had been slavery in the North also, but by 1818, 1820, there was no slavery per se in the North. It was only in the South. And one of the specific reasons for that was an economic connection between slavery, between the slave trade, and between making money and wealth and power in the American South. And so slavery was very, very significant and very important for white slave owners and property owners in the South. And so when the opportunity came to move into more Western territory, many from the South who were interested in the land, just like everybody else, brought their slaves with them. This whole function, this whole desire to bring their slaves with them into the West was going to be very, very significant and perpetuate later what we all recognize as the outbreak of the Civil War. It was one of those factors that caused the outbreak of the Civil War. So from the Treaty of Guadalupe, Hidalgo, the places in yellow, in red, pink, I'm colorblind or something. Those, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, California, but really it's even more than that. It's parts of, it's more Colorado. Anyway, that's generally the area that we received because of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. I say that because this precipitates these next things that we're talking about. And again, in history, in talking about history, it would be nice if we can talk about this particular thing, talk about the next particular thing, that'd be great. But history doesn't operate like that. A lot of these things are happening at the same time. And so, because we can't talk about them at the same time, we talk about them piecemeal, but remember that a lot of these things are happening at the same time. So you have expanding to the west, these new people now. It's not just territory, it's people. Why? Because when all that area was part of Mexico, and Mexico was very large, Mexico went all the way up almost to Oregon, over there, the Mexican territory. Mexico took over from what Spain had. And New Spain, the empire of New Spain, went all the way up to Oregon. And so when Mexico took it over, it was almost the same territory. So who lived there? Well, there was two kinds of people who lived in this territory before North Americans ever started moving west. And those people were Native Americans and Mexicans, because it was part of the Mexican empire. When we, the United States, received that territory in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, those people were still there, and those people stayed there. Remember that, as we talk about this westward movement. For our purposes in this particular presentation, women, of course, went west with their families, and there were about 40,000 people who made that trek over the years in this first particular movement. But then, what happens next? And this is one of the trails that they took. It's called the Oregon Trail. For those of you who ever remember watching cowboy pictures when you were younger, they would always talk about the Oregon Trail, or they usually always talk about the Oregon Trail. And this is it. And then just take a minute to see where it was to the North Platte, Independence. You may have been in some of these places, all through Western Territory. And these are all territories now because we just got it. They're not states yet. And all the way almost to the West Coast. So that's one of the ways that these people used to go. People used to also go by sea. There was no Panama Canal, so they had to go all the way around South America and come up to the west. And people did that. Not as many, because it took a very, very long time, and it was expensive, and it was dangerous. The route around the tip of South America was very, very dangerous. And then, what happens to make matters, as far as the Mexicans and the Native Americans were concerned, to make matters much, much worse, was that they discovered gold in California. Gold in California, this is all around the same time, 1847, 48, 49, all around the same time. And so when gold was discovered in California, even more people came out to the west. We have on the right some pictures of people moving out there, the different ways they used to come. We're going to talk about the Conestoga wagon. We have a picture of that, no?
This is the Conestoga.
Oh, that's it? Okay. So the Wagon Train, again, if you've seen cowboy pictures, you've seen many about wagon. I think there was a show called Wagon Train, as a matter of fact. And they came with these big wagons. Again, women and men. White women, black women, because the Confederates brought the slaves with them. Coming into a place where there were already Native American women and Mexican women. Remember what I said in the very beginning, this conflict going on among and between women all during this time period. And nowhere was it maybe a little bit more evident than this westward expansion, where these women were all of a sudden meeting each other, sometimes for the first time. And there was an inequality, obviously, between the black and white women in the first place. And then when the Mexicans and Native Americans were thrown into the mix, it was even worse. There were a lot of sexual crimes. During the gold rush, it was mostly men who began to go to make their fortunes in the West. It was a very, very dangerous, just to expand the meaning of this a little bit, it was a very, very dangerous venture. We're talking about a pandemic now. In the 1840s, when this was going on, there was a cholera epidemic in the United States because Europeans, cholera had burst out in Europe and the Middle East, and they had brought that with them when they came to America. And of course, like everything else, it spread like wildfire. And there was no vaccine, there was nothing. And so cholera was a very, very dangerous and killed a lot of people, was very dangerous, killed a lot of people. Besides the travel itself, the travel was very, very dangerous. Just one example, there were new plants in the West that people came and they would try to eat them and stuff like that. Some of them were poisonous, some of them made them sick. There were insects, animals, wild animals. There was conflict, of course, with Native Americans that took place during this time. And then what would happen to exacerbate this even more was, okay, we're doing Mary's story first. I forgot the order, okay. So, what, baby?
Nothing.
I wanted to point this out. So one of the first people, two things. I recommended books in the very beginning, and one I wanted to introduce here because it's very relevant to what we're going to be talking about. It's almost written like, it doesn't read like a textbook, but it looks like a textbook, and this is a book called Through Women's Eyes. I'll pass it around, you can look at it if you want to. It's written by a couple of authors, and it's excellent in terms of this stuff. If you ever wanted to read more stuff about it, I'm going to start reading it. You can take a look at that if you want. And Mary Stuart was, as it says on the thing, the first African-American woman to make public lectures about women's rights and make public anti-slavery speeches. Now think about it. During the age of slavery, this black woman actually got up and made these, now mostly in the North, granted mostly in the North, but some of the border states also. And she was very, very significant, and even starting to make this aware to the public. So this brings up another very, very significant point about something to remember as we talk about the rest of this, of this movement towards women's votes. The women's movement, I'll say this a couple of times maybe during the course, the women's movement was inexorably tied together with slavery, with the fight realization, there's a lot of different ways to put this, the feeling some people came to it after a while, the anti-slavery, or what we would call the abolitionist movement. Women's movement, abolition, making insane asylums more human, for want of a better word, reforming prisons. These reform movements, all of these reform movements that we begin to talk about, all happened, again, interestingly, around this time, the 1840s, is when they began. So if you were so inclined, you as an individual person were so inclined to go and listen to a lecture or a discussion about women's rights, and you went to this hall, this library or hall, and there was this discussion, you noticed people, women and men, and then maybe 3 weeks later you'd hear about an abolitionist meeting, and you wanted to check that out because you were interested in those kinds of reforms, and you went, you would find the same people, a lot of the same people. And as we go along, and as we talk about some of these individual women, and that's another thing I want to talk about in a minute, these individual women, you find that very, very many of them were not only abolitionists, but were in favor of women's rights. One of the things, two of the other things that were very, very instrumental in all of these people, and again, to remember all of these different things that people are interested in, was the anti-liquor movement, abstinence and the anti-liquor movement, and again, inexorably tied with all of this, religion, particularly Protestant Christianity. There were Catholics in the United States, and there were Jews in the United States, but they didn't have much of a public voice. There was much prejudice against those two groups in particular, Catholics and Jews, in what was essentially a Protestant nation, at least with quotation marks around it, in terms of the population. There were some particularly noted areas that had large Jewish congregations or had large Catholic congregations. But essentially it was a Protestant, and then becoming a very Protestant evangelical, which is different. It's a little bit more, a little different focus. And that was also part of all of these reforms that we begin to talk about. You're going to hear about a lot of these women leaders being Quakers, not by accident. The Quakers, basically a religious movement, were inexorably tied with abolition of the slave trade and slavery and the women's movement.
Joe, I have a question.
Where?
Me.
You?
Me,
Yes,
sorry.
ma'am.
You mentioned about these meetings where you would see the same people from abolition, prohibition, whatever. Were they marked? Were they harassed? Were they marked as, you know, a troublemaker, and even in those times?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, yes. Particularly, what would most likely particularly lead to opposition and even violence was if black and white people were in the same meeting at the same time. So, to answer your question, generally, yes, across the board. But particularly, some of the nastiest attacks where there's injuries and even death, where they burn buildings down and all this stuff, was if there was a meeting that had black and white people in it. That's what's so remarkable about her, about Mary Stuart in particular, because she was a black woman who addressed a crowd of white and black people. And it was like, oh my God, it was unheard of. Yes, ma'am?
And because there was such a mixture of people, even the Mexican women, the Indian, do you think at any point there were more women who were more important about being other women with them as opposed to, yeah, they're different, but we're all women? Or that didn't, they were so influenced by their husbands and their
Well,
even if it didn't matter?
I don't know if they were influenced by their husbands, or if it was, or if it was the influence of the philosophy of the time. There was, you know, race prejudice is something that, you know, we could do programs on race prejudice. But from this point of view, the notion that, remember we said before that the notion was that women and men were different? Well, even deeper than that was the notion that white men, European in particular white men, were superior to everybody else, to every other ethnic group. I don't want to use racial because, and I make this comment all the time when I do these programs, I had colleagues at the college in biology and the sciences who used to say, there's no such thing as race. There's only one race. There's no such thing as race. That dividing people into race has the same scientific substance as if we divided ourselves into blood types. And instead of saying blacks need not apply, we said type B people need not apply. It makes the same sense.
We're about caste.
Yes, you could put it that way. It's even yes, it's even more about caste. But in terms of the 19th century, we're talking about race as they defined it: white, black, or how they used to do it: white, black, brown, yellow, something else. Those was a hierarchy, and white men were superior to everybody else. They used biblical references to support that. They used economic and just the mere success about, look at all the different civilizations in the world, you know, what's the greatest civilization? The white civilization. They used those kinds of things. But we have to remember that in this whole discussion, when we're talking about this, it wasn't just that women didn't have any political power. There was this caste, like you said, caste system that was inherent, to the point where even some black people would think, well, yeah, that's my place. I can't go anywhere. This is my place. You know, I'm black and this is the deal. That didn't happen as often as we think it did, but it happened. So yes, that's something to remember all the time. Again, is what makes her achievements, and a lot of black women involved in the women's movement, even more significant, because they were fighting on 2 or 3 fronts at the same time. So, okay, so the next one is, what are we talking about here? I'm trying to think of where. No, I'm trying to think of, okay. So one of the most significant men that we talked about, because remember there were men, I keep on walking, I'm sorry. There were men amidst, besides being my lovely assistant, she is also keeps me in check. Talk too much or get somewhat. In any event. There were also men involved in this, and one of the most significant figures of all of the 19th century, there are some historians that say he is the most significant figure of the 19th century. I mean, think about that. Abraham Lincoln, you know, people like that, but they say this guy is. His name was Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was a slave, and around the time that he was a slave in Maryland, he had moved around to different places. And probably the 1830s, he freed himself. He's a big guy, and he had a physical confrontation with his master, who was very afraid of him after a while, and he just left. Now that was very, very difficult to do. Many, many people, many slaves, who tried to just walk away from their slavery were either recaptured, and things went horribly bad for them if they escaped and they were recaptured, or they died in the attempt to escape. And we'll talk about some laws that if they escaped, they were returned. People would pay a bounty to return them. But he was able to be very successful. He was a self-taught orator, very, very well read. really, at least, if not the, one of the most significant figures in all American history in the 19th century. And he was very, very pro the women's movement for equality, with one significant problem. Douglass believed all the time that before women could achieve their right to vote or political action, Africans had to be freed first. That freeing Africans, abolition, was more important. And we'll see a little bit later on how that is a major conflict in the movement, in the women's movement. But that he was a very significant, very sympathetic figure, very much knew a lot of the women leaders that we're going to be talking about. Yes, all of that. But there was that kind of conflict between how we were going to achieve these reforms and what reforms were more important than other reforms. Soldier to Truth. It's a book that came out recently that says that she may not have been as, I know I'm walking, I'm sorry. This is what I do in school, I walk around, sorry. Yes, ma'am. That she wasn't as significant as all that, but I don't believe that. In any event, she was a slave actually in the North, in New York. And she left, she freed herself, like Frederick Douglass. She not only freed herself, but she changed her name. Her real name was Isabella Baumfree, but it was her slave name. And a lot of African Americans felt that way. They had a slave name, and so she changed it to Sojourner Truth, and lived a healthy to a healthy age, 1797 to 1883. She would say what?
90 years old.
Yeah, 90 years old. She would very much be associated with something called, and you've heard about this, maybe you read the newest books about it, the Underground Railroad. Remember the Underground Railroad? She was very, very significant in that. She probably had an actual hand in some people who made it to Canada through the Underground Railroad. And she was a very, very, very significant figure. What is also kind of different about her is that some of these, the black women too, who were able to get to the point where they can talk in front of a mixed crowd and stuff like that, they were educated to a certain extent. Some of them were free black women, some, as we'll see, are ex-slaves. She was not particularly educated, and yet she had this visceral kind of effect on a lot of people who heard her speak. She was a very, very significant speaker. One of the white people who was a particularly significant ally of these women during this movement was a guy by the name of William Lloyd Garrison, 1805, 1879. You're gonna have to pick this up because I can't see it. And an abolitionist, the editor from 1831 to 1865 of a paper called The Liberator. Garrison's thing was anti-slavery, was abolition. That's what he was focused on. That's what he spent his money and his life about. Knew Frederick Douglass, knew many of these women who we're talking about. What's very interesting about him is that in his organization, again, remember, an abolitionist organization, he had many, many women as part of his speakers, women that were instrumental in developing his group. He not only talked about it, he actually did something about it. He hired a lot of women to work with him. Radical universalist, particularly about human dignity in general, all human dignity. Later he would speak up about Native Americans and Mexican Americans too. in 1833, he founded the American Anti-Slave Society. And again, Garrison, the paper, was one of the most significant harbingers of the abolitionist movement, particularly in the North, but even reached some areas in the border states and in the South. And we'd hear more about him a little bit later on. Lucretia, in your education, I'm talking about y'all, in your education, grammar school, high school, college, past whatever you had done, how much did you hear about the women's movement?
Very little.
Nothing.
Yeah, nothing.
I grew up in the
thought
South. We didn't hear anything.
I did all when I went to college.
Even in college, you did?
Yeah.
Your
I
son?
started to, yeah.
Okay.
My college had, there were courses on women's movement.
Yes, which was relatively new
And yes, it was.
at the time. And that I think is a general picture, that this kind of stuff wasn't talked about. It really wasn't talked about. So people like Lucretia Mott, we'll talk about Caddy Stanton, we'll talk about some of those other ladies, they're well known. But there are literally hundreds of women who were important to significant, to very significant in terms of this over the years. I mean, authors, teachers, doctors, all kinds of other people who we've never been taught about. It's only in the last 20, 30 years, and 30 years is pushing it a little bit, 20 years for sure, that there have been more books written about this stuff, that there have been women authors themselves. In the two books I recommend, the one I passed around is one of them. There's another that's basically a history of the United States. It's just a new history of the United States. And the author's name, I think it was on that thing, if you got it. Her name is Jill Lepore. Lepore. And that's what it is. It's a textbook. It's a history textbook, but not written like a textbook. It's very easy to read, I think. I think you would probably enjoy it. And more to the point of what I'm talking about, we're going to be talking about a lot of images. Lucretia Mott is a biggie in the movement, but others who perhaps you've never heard of, you may have, because you guys may have, because you might have read about it, that I never heard of until recently, until even in teaching on a college level, I came to know some of these people, and and living with my friend here who's interested in all of this stuff. I've read some other books that she's recommended, so it's new to us, to a lot of men in particular, but everybody. It's new to us. And that's indicative of the stuff that we've gone through, and maybe the fact that it's changing somewhat. Maybe. So, Lucretia Mott, 1793 to 1880, also, a Quaker, an abolitionist, a close friend of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and somebody who later on would counsel other people, younger women, as well as some of our contemporaries, in women's rights, and what exactly was going on with women's rights. And this is another theme that I'd like you to remember. When the women cooperated with each other, they cooperated with each other in a very, very significant way. And they would teach each other, and they would learn from each other, and they would work with each other. And this was also going on. When we get to, if we get to the Civil War during this time period, maybe? No? We're not? Anyway. The Civil War and some of these other things that we'll probably talk about more next week. We'll see how very, very important that was, and how important that continues to be. So, Lucretia Mott, well done.
Next.
Yep. Charlotte 410, African American woman, 1837, 1940. 410 was the grandmother of Charlotte 410 Grimke, who is a little bit more important in the movement. We'll talk about the Grimkes in a little while. But a wealthy African American woman, unusual, but no stranger to racial prejudice, attacked by mobs in Pennsylvania because black and white women were meeting together when she was speaking, and they couldn't abide by that. Pennsylvania. I'm not talking about South Carolina or Louisiana. We're talking about Pennsylvania. So for those of us in the North who are a little bit smug about, well, that was happening down South and all that stuff, it wasn't so long ago in the 1840s, etc., that there was not slavery in the North, 1820, 1825, 1830 in some places, that there was still slavery. But the attitude towards black people was not one that was, you know, the Northerners wanted equality for black and the Southerners didn't. No. That wasn't the situation at all. An anti-slavery movement in the North, yes, absolutely. That developed very, very slowly and got stronger and stronger and stronger. But it's a mistake to think necessarily that the North was, or the feelings of Northerners was any much different in terms of their attitudes towards black people in the South. When people got on the Underground Railroad to move north, they weren't going north, they were going to Canada. They wanted out of the country. 410 was, again, very, very unusual because she was wealthy, a wealthy black woman. And so because she was wealthy, she was able to get away with, in terms of talking about it from the point of view of racism, she was able to get away with a lot more than she would have. If you were a poor black woman, you were, there were 2 strikes, 2.5 strikes against you already. Want to end with the group, please? No? Okay. So, a name that would be significant because of their daughters later on and everything, a family, the Grimke family. Wealthy, slave-holding family, interesting, right? In South Carolina. They moved to Philadelphia because they wanted out from territory where slavery was so prominent, so they moved to Philadelphia. They became Quakers, hoo-ha, and preached abolition in most of the places where they could get a place to speak and a crowd to join them, which they drew great crowds.
While being slaveholders?
They weren't slaveholders, their parents were.
Oh.
They lived among slaveholders,
Okay.
and they hated it, so that's why they moved to Philadelphia. Against slavery, mixed audiences, threatened by general associations of Congregationalist clergy. The clergy threatened them to stop what they were talking about. It was disruptive, et cetera, et cetera. Remember remember 2 things, and I say this all the time. Everybody profited from slavery. Everybody. Churches, official churches, Catholic, Protestant, farmers, landowners. I compare it very, very much when I'm talking about movements in the 19th and 20th century to the drug situation in recent times in the 20th century. So you have drug dealers and stuff who make the most money out of drugs. But there's a whole chain of folks along the way that make money in the drug business. And the same was true of slavery. Christians, Jews, Muslims in Africa and the Middle East all made a lot of money and a lot of profit out of slavery, out of African American slavery. Again, as I said before, slavery is something that's been, if we look at world history in general, slavery's been around since the very beginning that we were recording history. But African American slavery, if we can reduce it from around the end of the 1400s to the end of the 1800s, African American slavery, everybody was involved in it, everybody along the way. Huh? I'll take that question. Everybody was involved. So the Grimke sisters, again, the ties to Quakerism, the ties to speaking to mixed crowds about slavery, to getting pushback about their feminism, about their abolition, about their interpretation of scriptures, the Judeo-Christian scriptures. They were getting pushback about all of that. And so, why did I put Polk in here? Polk was president of the United States when we went to war with Mexico. So he, in some ways, is the perpetrator of all of this that leads to the expansion in Mexico. Would the United States have expanded to the West anyway without a war with Mexico? And or, putting it another way, was a war with Mexico inevitable because the United States wanted to expand? A lot of historians say yes, on both counts. Putting that aside for a second, James Polk, not a great president in terms of lining up great presidents, but one of the most successful presidents in American history. Why do I say that? Because he had like 3 or 4 things he wanted to accomplish, and he accomplished all of them. One of the ones that was very, very high on his list was he literally, and I'm going to put it in not so elegant terms, he wanted California and Texas. He wanted them. He wanted California and Texas to be part of the United States. And so he perpetrated what eventually would become the Mexican-American War. He made Mexico go to war with the United States. He made them go. He invaded Mexico, he made threatening gestures. After a while, the Mexicans said, hey, you know, you can't like push us back and push us back. They reacted, and he was like, the Mexicans invaded Texas, we have to go to war with Mexico, boom, boom, that was it. This is after, of course, and here's another thing if you remember, the Alamo, the infamous or famous Alamo. Now that was right before the war with Mexico. And the fact of the matter is, remember all these people that I said were going west and going west and going west? Well, a lot of people went into Texas because Texas had a lot of land. It was selling it like, I'm telling you, like 3 cents an acre. It was ridiculously cheap. Even for the time, 3, 4, 6 cents an acre. That's where it was. So they were coming, and when the Southerners came, they were going to grow things, they were going to work, they brought the slaves with them. Which is what we talked about before. And eventually what happened is that a great amount of these Texans were not satisfied so much with just having Texas. They either wanted an independent country, if you remember the Lone Star State for Texas, or at least, and this is what won out, they wanted to be part of the United States. So for that reason, for the reason that California expanded into this wonderful place that had all this land and not many people, you know, forget about the Mexicans and the Native Americans that were living on it, this is land for us to take, etc., etc. For all those reasons, manifest destiny, hoo-ha, etc., he initiates a war with Mexico. And so I have him here to point out that this was even at the top leadership of the country. These feelings of the superiority of the white American class, the white Euro-American class, etc., went all the way to the top to the bottom, all the way through U.S. history. Okay. So what? Now what?
Did he
Okay.
die in office?
No,
Okay, shortly.
shortly after. We'll end with Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary Wollstonecraft was British. And next week when we begin to talk about, it's a habit. Thank you. Yes, ma'am. Mary Wollstonecraft was British. And we're going to talk about the significance of, like everything else in our history, government, culture, etc., we owe a lot, or we received a lot from Great Britain, obviously. Mary Wollstonecraft lived from 1757 to 1797, a British activist, wrote Vindication of the Rights of Women, affected U.S. women's attention to marriage, women's roles and rights. She was also the mother of Mary Wollstonecraft, I believe, who wrote Frankenstein. Which was interesting in and of itself, why a young upper-class woman should write this, horrible story about this half undead, anyway. So that's her other claim to fame. But I introduced her because next week, when we talk about the stuff we're going to talk about, I will introduce some of the results of the influences from Great Britain, especially the Pankhursts and other people from Great Britain. So, questions, comments, observations?
I have an observation.
Did you?
I did. Based on the pictures that were shown, the black women had very refined features and were very light-skinned. And the one picture of Frederick Douglass showed a very African-looking black man and rugged, hard features, wide nose. Yet the women had not aquiline noses, but their features were more gentle.
More white?
Yes. I was trying not to use that, but yes, they were more white. Were they 100% black?
Or were they
These-
slave owners? Were they
Or were they of
Children
mixed
slave
race?
owners? Not the ones in the pictures that I showed you.
Maybe it was intentionally done to make them look like that?
I don't think so.
I think they're actual pictures,
I mean,
aren't
if you
they?
look at
touch-ups?
if you look at Sojourner Truth, I don't think she looks particularly whitish.
Well,
We'll have to go down to Newburgh and find out.
You know, they put a statue of her on the
Right.
way over the Hudson.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really
And
cool.
I
also
think
gonna
it's
put a
about
statue-
time that
they're gonna put a
women were
statue of her
recognized.
in Times Square.
No,
Not
I think
Times
it's,
Square.
I think it's by the Newburgh Library, it's by the Newburgh.
No, there was one at
It's
the
also in Manhattan.
Oh, right.
Germany man,
Oh, in Central Park.
Central Park.
Park, yeah.
All right, so she certainly looks African American or African.
I think if you look at the pictures again, they look African American.
I don't, look at her.
You don't think she looks
Very light.
African American?
She looks-
Well,
But
that,
that's not accidental.
but that lends itself to the whole notion
Right.
of, I mean, I see black people on TV and stuff, and I say to myself, I know a lot of white people who are darker than him.
Right, me too.
Not
Yeah.
not all black people are the color of
Right.
this.
No, but as I said, their features, she's much gentler features.
But you,
And
but
And
listen to what you're saying.
I'm-
She has gentler features.
Right.
I-
Well, look at the difference between, let's say, her nose and his
Yeah,
nose.
right. Could be the part of Africa you come from too.
Well, that's what I'm, so,
Or,
I'm-
I don't know, that, I'm sorry, it was just my observation.
oh, I understand that, and that's fine.
That they looked, they had more refined features, more Caucasian
were they
looking
more educated,
features.
just out of curiosity, than Sojourner Truth?
Now
was?
look at her.
Yes.
She looks more Indian than African.
Well, but that's the point. What does African look like? We have, like, white people have their notion of what Africans should look like, which is racist, if you think about it.
Absolutely.
Right. So the fact of the matter is that that shouldn't have anything to do with anything.
My point, though, is because in my eyes, my perception of Charlotte 410 and, I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the other lady, their features are more Caucasian than African.
But again, that's the point.
Might be
Uh,
good.
What is, what does African look like? To
Well, based
you,
on,
well, to you, it may be someone who's much darker, has a wider nose, has this, has that, but the point of the abolitionist movement, later, not even during the 1840s and 50s and 60s, but later, is that that's made up. It's like, well, what white people think black people should look like. That would be like a black person saying, well, you don't look white enough because you're this and you're that. It's just,
okay,
I don't know.
well, I just thought maybe
I
perhaps
understand.
that they were mixed race. That was my,
It doesn't seem to be.
Okay.
From what I've read in their biographies, most of these people that I'm talking about are not mixed race.
Okay.
Now, some of their children may
yes.
have been mixed race because, and the Grimke's in particular, the Grimke's, their grandchildren and stuff like that, some of them I think were mixed race.
Mm-hmm,
Because their masters of certain children had raped and or had sex with their slaves,
right,
and that was the result, but not ordinarily.
okay, thank you.
Absolutely. Any other questions? Comments? You've been a lovely audience. Hopefully you'll come next week, and we'll talk soon.
Very good.
Thank you very much.
I'm
Thank
amazed,
Thank you.
I'm amazed that